My name is Gregory Pfeiffer. I am the Executive Director of the Institute of Current World Affairs, or ICWA, as we call it. It is great to see everybody here tonight, especially with the events going on in the Eastern Mediterranean, where Turkey, of course, held the nail-biter of its first round presidential election, parliamentary elections last weekend. And there are parliamentary elections coming up in Greece this week. What's certain amid this flux is that Greece's role in the region and in wider geopolitics is evolving in the wake of the global financial crisis, the Kremlin's war in Ukraine, and Western liberal democracies' wider rivalry with Russia, China, and other authoritarian countries. Stephen Tagle, our Stavros Niarchos Foundation Fellow, is nearing the end of 2 years living and researching Greece's border zones. He was in 3 regions in northeastern Evros. He was on the western island of Chios, and now he's finishing up his fellowship from Crete. And it has been an amazing fellowship. And we're also very grateful for the Stavros Niarchos Foundation's support for the fellowship. So Stephen will talk and describe some of his conclusions from his fellowship, and then he will join our expert panel, which I know is going to have a terrific discussion. But first, I'd like to say just a few words about the Institute of Current World Affairs. We send outstanding young professionals abroad for 2 years of independent research, writing, and reflection. They report about globally important issues in countries around the world. Fellows gain deep experience of the societies in which they live, and they go on to become some of America's leading experts in global cultures and affairs. And I have to say, we've been doing this for almost a century. So Stephen is following in some very big footsteps and doing it very well. He's been exploring how the geopolitics, history, and culture of Greek border zones inform Greece's identity, the identity of its society, and Greece's role in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Balkans, in Europe, and really around the world in the Transatlantic Alliance. He previously served as speechwriter for the U.S. Embassy in Athens, and he was also the recipient of an Asian American Writers Workshop Margins Fellowship, a Fulbright Fellowship to Greece, and a Soros Fellowship for New Americans. So Stephen will speak for 20 minutes about his fellowship, then join our panel, followed by a Q&A with you, the audience. And now I'm very pleased to introduce Stephen.
Thank you, Greg, for that great introduction and for your steady guidance and sharp editorial eye throughout the fellowship. I also want to thank the Institute of Current World Affairs Board of Trustees for believing in me and granting me this life-changing opportunity to delve into a country I've come to call a second home. I'm very proud to be ICWA's inaugural Stavros Niarchos Foundation Fellow. The foundation is committed to spreading Hellenism and building a better Greece. Throughout my fellowship, I've seen its philanthropy at work in programs like New Agriculture for a New Generation, which taught Chios mastic farmers best practices for propagating their trees, and the Bold Health Initiative, delivering PET CT scanners in hospitals like in Alexandroupoli and Heraklion. I hope the Foundation's support of ICWA's mission to advance American understanding of international cultures and affairs will develop into an ongoing collaboration. I've lived in Greece for 7 years now, mostly in Athens, the country's decision-making center. During 2.5 years as a speechwriter at U.S. Embassy Athens, I learned that the most important geopolitical developments were happening not in the capital, but on Greece's periphery. ICWA enabled me to spend 2 years writing about 3 of these consequential border regions: the region of Evros in northeastern Greece, the northeastern Aegean island of Chios, and the island of Crete. I'm going to focus my remarks this afternoon on Evros and its capital, the port city of Alexandroupoli, because it's a region that demonstrates Greece's growing leadership in a number of important regional and transatlantic issues, from defense and energy security to migration and border control. Located in the extreme northeast corner of mainland Greece, bordered by Turkey and Bulgaria, Evros is an agrarian region, the least economically developed of my 3 bases. Its forests and wetlands are landscapes of stunning natural beauty. And when I arrived in October 2021, the flat Thracian plain was covered in white tufts of cotton ready to harvest. The region of Thrace is also home to Greece's Muslim minority, and driving through the mountains, you'll find small villages with minarets that peacefully coexist with a Christian community. During the Cold War, Evros was seen as a place of exile, a sort of buffer zone, abandoned and neglected at the foot of the Iron Curtain. Greek government leaders routinely threatened to send underperforming civil servants to Evros, and most Greek men equate it with their year of compulsory military service. It's not a place many Athenians would like to be assigned. But for me, spending 10 months in Alexandroupoli presented a unique opportunity to experience one of the last untouched parts of Greece, a culturally diverse region in a strategic geographic location few Greeks and even fewer Americans know well. Early in my fellowship, I spent several days inside the security perimeter at the port of Alexandroupoli's cargo terminal, while the 228-meter-long cargo ship, ARC Independence, unloaded over 700 vehicles and helicopters, the largest transfer of US military equipment through the port at that time. I spoke with local stevedores who lashed vehicles to the ship's floor with chains, US soldiers beginning their rotation in Greece, and local business owners hoping to profit from the growing US presence in their sleepy seaside town. Most of my contacts welcomed the American presence, a shift from the anti-Americanism of previous decades as Greece anchors itself more firmly in the West. Today, previously neglected Evros has taken on the characteristics of a boomtown, with new food vendors near the port catering to American tastes. A marketing and communications consultant at the Evros Chamber of Commerce told me the US presence elevated local businesses' morale during the cloudy pandemic period and was important in helping the city shed its Balkan mindset and become more international and more extroverted. Konstantinos Hatzimichail, CEO of the Alexandroupoli Port Authority, exemplified the friendly, accessible tone of the city's business class. He emphasized that the city's fate is tied to its Aegean Sea port, which offers direct road and rail links to Eastern Europe and the Black Sea. That's why the city thrived as a vibrant trade and administrative center in the early 20th century, and it's why the US military began investing in the port in 2019 as a faster, cheaper, and more reliable alternative to transport through the Bosporus Strait in Istanbul. Several months later, when Russia invaded Ukraine and Turkey closed the Bosporus to military vessels, Alexandroupoli became a key staging point for the transportation of NATO military equipment to reinforce its eastern flank. In the spring and summer of 2022, US carriers moved tanks and armor to Poland by rail and convoys to Romania. US and NATO military equipment bound for Ukraine has also been shipped through the city. This past November, the Greek government shelved plans to privatize the port. Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis said the asset was too important to relinquish. The port is just one example of how Greece's strategic geographic position and the maturity of long-term investments have benefited the transatlantic alliance as the ongoing war in Ukraine shifts the West's geopolitical focus back to southeastern Europe. In concert with strategic investments in defense and transportation infrastructure, Greek energy projects are helping Europe and the Balkans rapidly reduce their dependence on Russian gas. When Russia cut off gas supplies to Bulgaria in April 2022, Greece stepped up to help its neighbor meet 90% of its gas needs with liquefied natural gas, or LNG, delivered through its Revithousa terminal. The natural gas interconnector Greece-Bulgaria, or ICGB, also came online in October 2022, connecting the two countries' national gas networks and serving approximately 1 billion cubic meters of Azerbaijani gas to Bulgaria, 1/3 of its current need. I visited the ICGB construction site in Haskovo, Bulgaria, to see cranes lay the final lengths of the 182-kilometer pipeline. According to journalist John Psaropoulos, the pipeline gains strategic significance in conjunction with a second LNG terminal scheduled for completion in Alexandroupoli by the end of this year. It could soon become the means for supplanting Russian gas throughout the Balkans with LNG from the US, Qatar, and Egypt, bolstering Greece's ambition to become Southeastern Europe's entry point for natural gas. Evros's position on the Greek-Turkish land border also makes it a flashpoint for tensions between the two countries. For decades, the NATO allies have argued over maritime and airspace boundaries, hydrocarbon exploration rights, and Turkey's occupation of northern Cyprus. The residents of Evros take seriously their role as akritis, frontier dwellers and guardians of the border. The word, often used by officials who visit the two regions, encapsulates their anxiety, defiance, and pride over being on Greece's front line. Pater Ioachim, a village priest of Dadia, described religion's role in demarcating identity at the border. "We are the beginning of Greece," he told me. "It's important we ring the church bell because it can be heard across the border. Just as I wake up and hear the call to prayer from the other side, Muslim religious leaders can hear my bell." In February 2020, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan directed thousands of Afghan, Iranian, Iraqi, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and Syrian asylum seekers to the Evros land border in an attempt to pressure the European Union. Though caught off guard, local police and army forces managed to hold the border for several days until reinforcements arrived. It was a community effort. Village women delivered vanfuls of homemade pies to the front. Farmers and fishermen patrolled the Evros River to prevent migrants from crossing. Sakis Kamilaris, a big man in a camo windbreaker who has been navigating the Evros Delta since he was 11 years old, said he answered the police request not out of heroism, but out of duty. "We're not heroes," he told me. "We were guarding our homeland, guarding our homes because that's what we were taught. Country, religion, family." While visiting Evros the following month, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen highlighted the importance of Greece's borders as the external borders of Europe and thanked Greece for serving as Europe's shield. Following the so-called Evros War, Greece's migration policy was subsumed under the banner of border security, and its borders were increasingly surveilled and militarized. While living in Evros, I visited a new 12-kilometer galvanized steel fence Greece constructed along the border and learned about the arsenal of high-tech equipment like heat-seeking cameras, sound cannons, and armored vehicles that police use to deter crossings. Evros, which until the late 19th century was part of the wider historical region of Thrace, has experienced large migration flows before. Like Chios and Crete, the region bears scars from the 1922 Asia Minor catastrophe, the Greek defeat by the Turks in Anatolia that resulted in the destruction of the cosmopolitan city of Smyrna and the displacement of 1.3 million Orthodox Christians and 400,000 Muslims. 100 years later, the catastrophe looms large in Greeks' collective conscience, connected with the reason Turkey is seen as wanting to do Greeks harm. Ankara's attempt to storm the Evros border has hardened local attitudes towards migrants. Many locals who identify as Asia Minor refugees view asylum seekers from the Middle East and Africa as illegal immigrants or even Turkish agents, in contrast to real refugees like the 100,000 Ukrainians fleeing war whom Greece has hosted so far. Migrants have crossed the border for years now, and we've always stopped to help them, said Eleni Baharidou, a descendant of refugees in Nea Visa. But that doesn't mean we can accept them and host them here forever. The Greek government's current policy of deterring migrants comes at the expense of solidarity and human rights. A particularly troubling development since the Evros border crisis is the rise of pushbacks, the illegal apprehension, detention, and expulsion of migrants from Greek territory without granting them access to asylum procedures. This systematic state policy has been well documented by journalists and human rights groups. I experienced it firsthand in Thrace when I was pulled over at gunpoint by a plainclothes officer in an unmarked gray van. Akis Maragozakis, a social worker whose grandparents came to Alexandroupoli as refugees in 1922, criticized the government's approach. Of course, if a person comes to Greece and you push him back, you've reduced flows by not allowing him to come in, he said. But it's not that he no longer needs asylum. The need still exists, but you violated his right to come and ask for protection. Pushbacks and violence against asylum seekers have been reported across Europe's external borders, in Poland, Italy, Spain, Croatia, and Romania. As climate change and conflict displace more and more people, Greece and Europe as a whole must strike a better balance between humanitarian and security concerns. As Stefanos Levidis, a researcher who investigates human rights violations in Evros, told me, I think we have a duty to make sure people are treated humanely at our borders, because the borders are a mirror of the society they enclose. So I hope this talk has demonstrated what's happening in Evros in terms of defense, energy, migration, and border security has far-reaching consequences for both Europe and the transatlantic alliance. By taking advantage of its crucial position in the evolving energy and security landscape, Evros has an opportunity to regain its historical role as Europe's gateway to the East. Angela Yanakidou, the revered president of the Ethnological Museum of Thrace, whom I nicknamed the grandmother of Evros, told me the border is the soul of Thrace. Borders are important, she said. The border with another, which separates but at the same time invites you to cross it. The border creates identity. If you don't know the other, you can't know yourself. Yanakidou is optimistic that international interest in Alexandroupoli will help bring this overlooked corner of Greece back into the spotlight. As she told me with a twinkle in her eye, this is the time for Thrace. Thank you. And I now look forward to hearing from moderator Paul Ray and my co-panelists Katerina Sokou and Gregory Maniatis. And I want to thank them for joining me to discuss Greece's transatlantic role as the country heads to elections this weekend. Thank you very much.
And now I'm delighted to introduce our stellar panel, starting with Katerina Sokou, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center and Washington, D.C. correspondent for the Greek daily paper Katimirini, where she's also a columnist focusing on transatlantic relations, foreign policy, and financial diplomacy. Gregory Maniatis, right next to me here, is the director of the Office of the Vice President for Global Programs at the Open Society Foundations. He previously served as senior advisor to Peter Sutherland, the UN Special Representative for Migration, and he was also a senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute in Washington. And our moderator, Paul Ray, at the end, is the Institute of Current World Affairs board chair, and also a former fellow in Turkey and Greece. He's also the Charles O. Lee and Louise K. Lee Chair in the Western Heritage at Hillsdale College, where he is a professor of history. He's the author of many books, most recently Sparta's First Attic War and Sparta's Second Attic War, and he writes frequently on contemporary politics and culture.
Okay, well, thank you, Paul, and I'm delighted to be here and would like to thank Ekwa and Steve for the invitation. I knew Steve from his speechwriting days in Athens, but met him again last summer, one especially hot and humid afternoon in the Mastika Museum in Chios. I remember he was genuinely concerned about the potential damage to the Mastika harvest by the unseasonal rains that August. And when we parted, I went to the beach, and he went on to inspect the damage to the mastika trees. And I recommend you read his dispatch about it. I thought it speaks volumes about his approach to this fellowship, how invested he has been to his subject, and he has gone on to write about two more topics that we discussed that day and define Chios. Its formidable shipping industry, and the grim fate of its inhabitants during the fight for Greek independence. And as we experienced listening to his presentation, his writings are biased on and enlivened by the people he meets. They offer insightful geopolitical analysis, but Steve also has the discerning eye of a writer who is seeking the pulse or the soul, if you will, of its place. So I cannot wait to read your dispatch from Crete and what you have to say about that place, very soulful place. Now, let me offer some thoughts about the premise of Stephen's presentation, that Greece's borders are the front lines of European security, energy, and migration issues. I thought it was wise of him to focus on Alexandroupolis and Evros to showcase all three aspects. And I would like to highlight some of the points that Steve made and maybe add a thought or two about them. One, the fact that the Alexandroupolis port offers access to direct road and rail links to Eastern Europe and the Black Sea. The fact that it is a faster, cheaper, and more reliable alternative to the Bosphorus Straits and has been very valuable for NATO and the US in transporting military equipment to its eastern flank and Ukraine. And I would add that the irritation that Turkey, a NATO ally, has shown in the use of the port suggests more than commercial considerations. It suggests the loss of some of this strategic leverage over its Western allies, and also of the economic and religious clout that it tries to exert over the Muslims in Thrace. Second, the FSRU, the regasification and storage unit in Alexandroupolis, that makes it possible for LNG to come to southeastern Europe, and the interconnector between Greece and Bulgaria that brings the gas from Azerbaijan through Turkey, but also the Alexandroupolis one to southeastern Europe. These are transforming Greece into a real energy gateway for both the region and beyond. Steve mentioned the Ambassador Payet comment assessment of the IGB, the interconnector, as being existential for Bulgaria when Russia cut off its supply of natural gas. I would note that the addition of the two Alexandroupolis FSRUs and other projects in other FSRUs in Greece will triple the regasification capacity of Greece this year, hence its role in bringing LNG to Europe. Third, I don't think we can overemphasize the turning point that the Evros border crisis that Steve described constituted for Greece. The concerted and desperate attempts of thousands of migrants and asylum seekers to breach Greece's borders, which lasted for days and was facilitated by Turkey's government, is a troubling case of the weaponization of migration that can happen. And for Greece, it transformed politically the migration issue from a humanitarian one to a matter of national security. And it is no coincidence that the border fence that Stephen showed us, has now bipartisan support ahead of the elections, and the option for EU funding too. Now, on a more general point, having lived in all those three places that are scarred by Greece's complicated history with Turkey, especially the Asia Minor catastrophe, but also the exchange of populations that followed, Steve brought up the concept of akrites, the Byzantine-era frontier dwellers and guardians of a border. It is indeed a predominant feeling among the population of Greece's borders that they are, in a way, performing that role. So for Greece, history, but also the recent tensions with Turkey, add a powerful extra meaning to its front line as a national border that is being contested by an increasingly nationalistic neighbor, including by hybrid threats like the weaponization of migration. I think we need to account for that layer in our analysis and also bring it into our thinking when we're hearing stories, migration stories from the borders. Now, if you ask me, should Greece serve as Europe's shield on migration? I do not think we should. There should be better burden sharing, both within the European Union and more engagement with neighboring countries to bring back the humanitarian and integration aspect of migration policy. But there is no denying that Greece was called to play that role. So finally, and beyond migration, it is true that the confluence of crises has forced Europe to prioritize its defense and security, including energy security, increasing the geopolitical relevance of Greece in its efforts to help stabilize its region and provide alternatives for Europe's energy and security concerns. This is a result, of course, of the war in Ukraine, but also the civil war in Syria before that, the unpredictable ally that the West finds in Turkey, the tensions in the Middle East. At the same time, as destructive as it was for people's livelihoods, the effort to overcome the Greek financial crisis has a silver lining for Greece's domestic politics, foreign policy, and economics that we can discuss. It led to the political marginalization of anti-Americanism that led to closer partnership with the US. It led to a renewed effort to engage internationally with constructive initiatives and a focus on Greece's part on the need to bring FDI, foreign direct investment, to make up for the lost growth and manage its public debt. So Greece has changed too, and is not only more geopolitically important, but also as aligned with the West as it's ever been. And the opportunity here is for the country to continue to build on its efforts to helping stabilize its region in partnership with its allies.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks to Gregory and Ikwe, and to the Nyarhos Foundation for making the investment in the kind of reporting that Stephen has done. Gregory shared my bio. It seems like I have been in the world of politics and foreign policy and philanthropy for a long time. But in the 90s, I published a magazine about Greece called Odyssey, and spent that decade getting to know some of the best writers about Greece, from around the world. And I think that Stephen's dispatches, if you haven't read them, are exceptional. I mean, he ranks for me amongst the most keen observers of Greece that I have read in decades. And I really urge you, they're exquisitely well reported, researched, and edited, and you will be drawn in immediately. I don't know how many of your dispatches are up there, but there were at least 12 to 15, if I'm not mistaken, right? They're all on the website, and they're all really terrific. Having dedicated my life to trying to get great reporting about Greece, I can assure you they're really fantastic. So Stephen, I want to just focus on one issue, which won't be a surprise to you, is immigration in Greece. I look at this great audience. I see many faces I know who are Greek or Greek American, and it makes me think about the theme of your fellowship, which was Greece, but also in the frame of transatlantic relations. And you talk a lot in very positive ways about shared interests, right? The shared interests around energy, shared interests around the war in Ukraine, the way in which the United States, post-financial crisis, played such an important role in defending Greece. I think that solidified, as you said, the relationship between the US and Greece. But looking out at this audience and reading about your experience, there's also shared experiences and shared values. And certainly the shared experiences are represented by this awesome Greek diaspora and the incredible Greeks like Katerina and others who make part of their lives in the United States, and how this country here is able to create an environment for them to thrive in, and a sense of sort of mutual respect and mutual interdependence in the United States. And I don't want to focus so much on the question of the border. I do work for the Open Society Foundations, and I am an evangelist within the foundations for legal pathways, and a skeptic about chaotic arrivals at the border, whether it is in the United States or in Europe. And I think that's something that can't be accepted by a government, because a government is there to provide physical and economic security, right? Like, if you cannot do that, you will be voted out. So that's really important. So I have no scathing critique of what happens at the border, except for the pushbacks, which you have done a good job of criticizing. But I also recognize that even that is a shared responsibility of Greece and the European Union, both in setting up systems at the border that would allow for the adjudication of asylum claims, but also for burden share. And you point out that of the people who arrive in Greece, 0.5% get relocated to another European country. That is wildly unfair, and Greece should be at the forefront of trying to solve for that. It was for a millisecond in 2015 when there were 1 million people. There were agreements to share hundreds of thousands. I think the number was initially 160,000. That program of relocation of refugees from Greece to other European countries petered out, right? So that's a really big issue. But I want to take it somewhere else, right, which is not about what happens at the border, nor is it about the breakdown of asylum procedures and chaos at the border. We see that in the United States as well. That isn't good. It's not good for anyone. But what was striking was your experience being stopped, and a sentence in your notes about, in your dispatches, that you've lived there for 7 years, and I'm not sure I remember this precisely, but you sort of imply that you don't know if you'll ever feel fully Greek, even though you've been there for 7 years. And you might end up spending 17 years Stephen got married last week. Congratulations. Um, so I wanted to ask you about that part of your experience in Greece. You have a country that has this mighty diaspora that has a long history going back to ancient Greece of really intermingling with the world. And yet, when you talk to people who come from a significantly different background, they do say that they would have a hard time feeling fully at home in Greece. I was talking to a young Afghan woman, actually she was raised in the UK, who runs an NGO, a series of NGOs providing social support to refugees in Greece today, and she said, I've lived in 13 different places, and the place, even though I look Greek, she's an Afghan woman with light skin, I don't feel like I'm at home in Greece. So I do side with the skepticism about letting people come in over the border in the way that they do. I even, to some degree, by the current government's assertion that it wants to create legal pathways to Greece. Greece is a country that's lost, as you noted, 3.5% of its population over the past 10 years. It needs people. It's not going to get it through larger families anytime soon. That doesn't kick in for generations. So thinking about it proactively and thinking about it as somebody who loves Greece, what is it about the country that you think could change, and how could it change for people to feel more at home there? And I will just end with one sort of thought I had as I was reading your dispatches, which is the dual role that all of these Greeks, wonderful young generation, much more compassionate perhaps, just like the millennials and Gen Z is better than my generation in terms of having feelings and expressing emotions and being able to connect with people and being vulnerable, right? Like all that, I read your dispatches first, and then I saw the pictures, the photos, and realized, oh, these are these young women, relatively young women who are feeling as if they play two roles, a role of welcomer to a point, but a role of defender. And so these places that you write about are places that have had to define themselves as defenders of not just the nation, but of the faith, Christianity, and of the West, right, for hundreds of years vis-a-vis the Ottoman Empire. Up north also against the Soviet Union and the Soviet system. And that seems to be coming into real tension with the side of being Greek, which is about philoxenia, right? It's like philoxenia and xenophobia is a very quick, it seems, transition up in the borders. And is that a function of having to have lived at the, at a civilizational border for hundreds of years?
Yeah. Thank you so much for your comments, Gregory. I think there was this joke that I heard that, Greeks are, on the one hand, such hospitable and welcoming people, but at the same time there can be also these sort of racist elements or in-group elements. And I think this comedian said that Greeks like it when you come to visit, but they don't like it when you stay. And I think one thing that can help to help Greece to become more accepting in a way is to just continue to increase exposure to the West and to other cultures. I think places like, if you contrast, for example, Evros, which is rarely visited until now, with Chios, for example, which has this long history of Greeks who have lived abroad, traveled, socialized with different cultures, and facilitated trade and business between all these different major cosmopolitan cities. There's a very different mindset between the people from those two regions, I found, and that acceptance and familiarity with other cultures just seeps into the DNA of people from Chios, I found. And so whereas, lots of the places I've been, especially even especially Alexandroupoli or Evros compared to Athens, there's much less diversity. You'll be hard pressed to find it, even a Pan-Asian restaurant in Alexandroupoli, whereas there's starting to develop this like little Chinatown in Syntagma in Athens. So I think these sort of trends just and this sort of familiarity with other cultures, that's something that's I think slowly developing in Alexandroupoli as you get more Americans passing. I think so. As someone who looks Asian American, I think I stand out very easily in just a crowd or a town or a village of Greek people. And I think one thing I noticed, people were. It's also easy to just spot Americans as you've had soldiers come spend time in Alexandroupoli. They always really stick out. People talk about them jogging early in the morning, things like that are sort of a little bit more alien to Greek culture. But I think as there's increased cooperation between Greece and other countries, especially in these areas that haven't seen a lot of diversity, I think these sort of attitudes will permeate, and I think they'll help with the business culture. They'll help with some of these social issues, and that's sort of the new Greece that I think a lot of us are rooting for.
I'm going to start off with a question for you. It's a question related to this. When I was in Greece in the 70s and 80s, sort of floating about, footloose and fancy-free a lot of the time, one of the things I noticed is regionalism in Greece. So Macedonians, Karamanlis, supposed to have a certain character because they're from Macedon. Mitsotakis from Crete. They're all liars there. You can even find that in the New Testament, by the way. Is that regionalism still something strong in Greece? Because you went from one region to another, and probably you had conversations. Where have you come from recently? Oh, Thrace. Well, Thrace as well. What did you encounter? Or is it gone now? Because things do change.
No, there's definitely still a regionalism that exists, and I think I saw that contrast even more sharply because I was moving from one very diverse and specific region, border region, to another. So, for example, when I was in Evros, Angelina Akilu told me that Thracians, especially in northern Evros, are sort of the last really authentic people because they haven't been exposed to tourism. They don't have the sort of poniros, like the sly quality of Cretans who just want to take your money and treat you as tourists. And she told me to watch out for people from Kalamata, in the Peloponnese. So there are definitely these attitudes, and I think when I went to Chios, there were many more people would speak to me in English if I tried to speak to them in Greek. Same thing in Crete because of the tourism. And I think in Crete, even though I came in January, I sort of was immediately slotted into this box of being a tourist visiting the island, whereas I think when I was in Chios and Evros, it doesn't receive a lot of tourism. People weren't as sure where to put me, and so they were like a little bit more open to sort of more genuine interaction, sort of from the get-go, I would say.
Let me open it up now to the audience. We've got until 6:30, and it'll have to be cut off sharply at that time because they're going to turn off my machine here and other things. Yes, over there.
Thank you very much. My name is Mara Miller, and I'm a frequent visitor to Greece and represent Greek artists as well. My question, though, is about Chios, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the strategic importance of Chios, as it's where all the shipping magnates came from, and it's right in a key area, if you would, please.
Yeah, definitely. So Chios was the second location that I visited, and you know, for centuries, since the Byzantine and Venetian period, it's been this sort of trade hub between the Black Sea, Anatolia, and Europe. So one of the reasons that the island was so interesting to the Venetians was because of its key location. And the Venetians were responsible for setting up most of the main industries on the island. They structured the mastic villages in southern Chios, and they were responsible for bringing the citrus from the Middle East to Portugal and then eventually to the island, and that became a really big industry for the central part of the island. And then, like you said, the shipping industry began in Chios and in Nusus, and you know, Chios and Inusan ship owners now own 22% of the LNG, the liquefied natural gas fleet. And so they're also responsible for setting up a lot of the floating storage and regasification units, Chians especially. So for example, the Alexandroupoli FSRU is a shareholder in that company is the Chian company Gaslog from the Livanos family, for example. And the Procopio group is completed like an agreement with Germany to provide two FSRUs, to build two FSRUs in Germany. So it's a really interesting way in which, you know, this small island has an incredible outreach in terms of its global shipping footprint. And just because you're into art as well, there's a really incredible program called Dio on Chios. It's entering its third year now, and every year they bring incredibly curated artists to the island for the summer. So I highly recommend visiting it for that if you haven't.
When I was younger, there was a museum, a family museum there, with portraits going back to the time of England's Elizabeth I, of merchants from Chios based in London. I don't know whether it still exists. It's very near Chios town. It could be. I don't know. I don't remember the name of it, but I remember it was just amazing to see. Over there.
Just to follow on from your earlier comments, you've talked so much about external, internal migration. What did you see in terms of internal migration within Greece? Is the localism beginning to break down? Intermarriages? What's the education system doing to that?
So one thing that I noticed in terms of internal migration, you know, well, first of all, during the financial crisis, Greece had an incredible brain drain. It lost a lot of its young people to education and job opportunities abroad. And now tourism is a huge driver of the economy. So what you're seeing is people from all over Greece coming to work on the touristic islands from approximately April until end of October. So for example, on Crete, where I'm living now, especially because of the, you know, the cost of living crisis and the pandemic, there have been a shortage of workers at cafes and hotels. So they've sort of spread their net, and their people from all over Greece are coming to work on Chios, Santorini, Mykonos for the season. And that's sort of become an annual sort of turnover of people coming to these islands and then trying to earn enough to cover the entire year. So that's, I would say, the biggest internal migration.
Anything more permanent internal besides the external forces?
In terms of.
These are all driven by tourism. We're about losing Greece. You have entrepreneurs moving around, developing new areas. What do you see in this country in many ways?
So I would say that Athens is still very much seen as the center of Greece. It almost half the population of Greece lives in Athens. But there are developing sort of small pockets of entrepreneurship. You have startups in Patras, in Thessaloniki, where there's sort of an entrepreneurship hub for the Balkans. And also in Crete, there's the fourth research laboratory. So these are sort of areas where you're sort of developing brain gain. There are people who are returning to Thessaloniki, Greeks who have gone abroad, as new American companies have set up shop in Thessaloniki, for example. And I think hopefully that's a trend that will continue as as more international companies set up. And also I think the Greek government is pursuing this policy of digital nomadism. They're trying to, as part of the tourism umbrella, attract people to come and work in Greece year-long and giving them also tax incentives to stay. So hopefully as also the technology and Wi-Fi speed infrastructure develops, that'll just draw more and more people to Greece, and you'll see more shots of people working with their laptops on beaches and hotels and things like that.
The gentleman in the second row over here.
Thank you. Fotis Poliakis. I'm originally from Alexandroupolis, so great memories you brought back with a lighthouse in the background. Two things. We consider ourselves akrites, the edge of the world, protecting. The fear to this day is Turkey. And I think some of that psyche, because the immigrants came from that direction, was already tainted. So their fear and their overreaction may be because of that. So that question is, did you read that in their response? And second, is Alexandroupolis the port de jour, or is it permanent? Does it have permanence from the US perspective? NATO, but more to the US. Thank you.
Fotis, thanks so much for being here, and thanks so much for these questions. So, one thing that really struck me is when I took this tour with the guy who installed security cameras on the border, I met him at a dinner, told him I was interested in visiting the border fence, and he was like, "Oh, I could take you. I set up the security cameras on the border." So we jumped in his truck and we went out there. And the one thing that really struck me is just to see, once you get out into the fields on the actual border, right by the fence, you just pass these really deep trenches. And they have the trenches there because if Turkey was ever to invade, they could sort of blow up the small land bridge, and there would be these trenches that tanks wouldn't be able to pass. And they still have minefields right on the edge of those trenches as well. So that was just such a tangible example for me of how this fear still is just embedded in the land itself. And another point that I noticed when I spoke to the previous mayor of Chios, he brought up this exact point. He said that, we've been told since we were children that one day Turks may come in small boats to the island. And so he was arguing that, seeing refugees come in these small boats sort of just triggers something very instinctual for the local people of Chios. So I think that that's such a relevant point. And then in terms of is the port of Alexandroupolis the port du jour? I think it's much more than that, and I think it's because you have in Alexandroupolis the synthesis of both defense and transportation infrastructure, plus the energy system that's building, or the energy network that's building around this town. So they're just long-term, decade-long investments that have gone into Alexandroupolis. And it's just they're maturing at this period. So just all the work that's been put into it and all the thought and money isn't going to disappear the next day just because, just the from the very foundation of the city, the port and the railroad system together has created this combine that's put the city itself on the map. And the reason Alexandroupoli exists is because it's this transportation hub and energy hub. And I think that role is what will propel the city into the future.
There's a gentleman in the white-haired gentleman in the third row. Oh, sorry.
Second that in a way by saying that the consensus is that even if the war was to stop tomorrow in Ukraine, the energy dependence of Europe to Russia is gone. There won't be a return. So the energy needs of Europe will need to be serviced and served by other countries, other sources. And in that case, Alexandroupoli has a great role to play, potentially going forward for transportation purposes, beyond energy as well, for goods being transported from southeastern Europe to the rest of the world through the Alexandroupolis port or another port in Greece, potentially. So this is certainly something commercially, even if the security needs were to disappear tomorrow, which doesn't seem to be the case, it would still be commercially viable for the port to exist and very valuable for the region. And one more point to what Gregory said earlier about how the non-Greeks are being perceived in Greece, and as relates to migration as well. I feel that yes, Greeks are very hospitable, but they're not used to a multicultural society in the sense that the US or Canada is. And this is something that is a learned process. It's not something that happens overnight, by all means. And it would help so much if there were better integration policies in Greece. Some European countries, Portugal is doing a great job in that, and I think language helps in their case as well. Their migrants are Portuguese speaking mostly. But still, the idea of having effective integration policies that can actually bring people and integrate them and make them Greek, right? I mean, make them, or whatever they want to be, but integrate them, have the school system, in the workforce. This is something that Greece has done to the Albanians, by the way.
Absolutely.
So it's not something that cannot be done. It can certainly be done. Just need.
I agree.
Gentleman in the third row, white-haired gentleman.
Thank you, Paul. Paul knew me when my hair was the color of this lady's jacket. I'm Michael Weaver. I was struck by, in your presentation, the border confrontation that was there. I also recall in the last couple of years discussions about potential conflict over oil rights in the Mediterranean. And so my question is, both Turkey and Greece are members of NATO. There is, I believe, in the NATO agreement something about one NATO member being invaded. This may be a question for you, Paul, but if one NATO folk attacks in a meaningful way another NATO folk, what then?
So yes, you're exactly right. There is this clause within NATO that if one NATO member is attacked, then the other members have to come to its aid. And I think Article 5, exactly. And I think it's not an article that's been really tested in practicality. So I think that, especially from the U.S. perspective, they're hesitant to make the Turkey-Greece case the case where they test Article 5. But I think, for the most part, the U.S. and other countries have tried to use diplomacy to kind of lessen tensions between the two countries. And another way that Greece has sort of gotten around this, having a conflict with another NATO ally, is to create these sort of bilateral defense and security agreements with specific powerful nations like the US and like France. So for example, in the Port of Alexandroupoli and Ceuta Bay in Crete and a couple other sites in Greece fall under the Mutual Defense Cooperation Agreement, a bilateral agreement between the United States and Greece. And during the past couple years, there have been updates to this agreement that have increased the length of the agreement from 1 year to 5 years in order to facilitate greater cooperation in these particular sites in Greece. And one of the big Greek asks on this agreement was to have language saying that if Greece were to be under attack, the United States would come to its aid. And that same language was requested in the defense agreement between Greece and France. So I think Greece is sort of hedging its bets and trying to work with allies like the United States and France in order to sort of cover its bases, even in the case that there could be a larger issue with Turkey.
Greg.
Thanks, Paul. I have a question for all of you. I'd like all of you to weigh in on this, if you don't mind. And the question is that Europe is changing. It's in flux. The security architecture is changing, thanks largely to Russia's war in Ukraine. But Greece has been experiencing sort of shattering change for well more than a decade. It had the global financial crisis, which shook society and turned politics and the political establishment upside down. One of the things that I also sort of a sub-question is what's happening with anti-Americanism, which is now receding, thanks partly, if I'm not mistaken, to the United States' response to the global financial crisis. And yet, nevertheless, it seems that, and I say this as a dilettante observer, so I may be wrong, but it seems that politics is becoming more conservative and conventional and sort of returning after the sort of the brief flare of the Syriza party. So how transformational is this moment really for Greece?
Thanks, Greg. So I think one thing that's really interesting about the history of anti-Americanism in Greece is that it's coming from the left side, not from the right. So when Syriza came to power, they slowly moved from being more, the more extreme left anti-Americanism to being collaborators and cooperating with the United States on a variety of issues, including an update to the MDCA, the defense agreement. So I think that agreement by Syriza and by the Greek left made it much easier for New Democracy when they came to power to just continue to align with the United States and to continue its closer ties with the U.S. And so one thing that the former ambassador Jeffrey Pyatt told me was that there are no longer political points to be gained from anti-Americanism in Greece as a result of the financial crisis and the closer collaboration from the past 5 or 6 years. And so you'll still see a little bit of anti-Americanism from the extreme left, from the Communist Party, for example, protesting against American bases and against NATO. But for the two mainstream parties, I think that's no longer an issue.
I agree. I researched the U.S. role in the Greek debt crisis during my time in Washington, D.C. And one striking and tangible way to see the change is in public opinion polls. And during the Greek debt crisis, it was obvious, and especially in the aftermath of it, in 2015, 2016, 2017, you would see that when the Greek public was asked about the US and the role they played and who's your biggest ally and who you can depend on, it was for the first time the US was up there, and this had a lot to do, indeed, with the fact that during the Syriza government, the Obama administration was key to securing Greece's place in the Eurozone. And it helped tremendously the leadership of Syriza take the decision to stay in the Eurozone and not contest in that summer where the Greeks were turning to their banks and trying to get money out of the banks. And it wasn't possible. And you couldn't use a credit card like issued in Greece in New York because your money was good for nothing. So back then it was critical that the Obama administration persuaded the Tsipras government, Tsipras himself, to persevere and change basically the referendum result on his own, even though the Greeks had voted as he had suggested against the memorandum. So this helped the Syriza government and the left more widely to warm up to the US and its role. And then we had the Prespa agreement, which was an agreement to resolve the question of the name of North Macedonia. Thankfully, finally, this country has a name for everyone, and it's something we can all agree on. And this actually opened, and I'm speaking now from the point of view of the American think tanks, the fact that you could have Greece contribute constructively to a solution to an issue in Southeast Europe, which had to do very much with the stability of the Western Balkans, and opened the way for the entrance of that country to NATO. This persuaded the American establishment that Greece can be a constructive player in the wider region. And the rest is history. The only thing I would add like as an asterisk, is this very high level of relations and between the US and Greece can be challenged if there is, an immense crisis between Greece and Turkey. Because then the US will have to take sides. And if we have another India crisis, this will not bode well for the Greek public and how they view the US. That's my only concern.
I'm 54 and have grown up between Greece and the United States. And for most of that time, I think I was privileged to be part of a generation when, which saw history sort of basically moving in the right direction. As an American, I was part of, went to college, the Cold War ended, the US was ascendant, moved back to Greece in 1991, and Greece was in the European Union, became the European Union, and the EU was the North Star for so much of what we thought would happen in the world, much more proximity to your neighbors, greater regionalization, countries, borders sort of becoming less significant. And that has changed pretty abruptly over the past few years, right? It's changed with Brexit, I think, first, and sort of the isolationism of the United States under the Trump administration, Hungary sort of dividing the European Union, so that positive energy that brought people and countries together has not only dissipated, but pretty abruptly reversed over the past few years. And I think in that context, it's really hard to make predictions, right? I think countries everywhere are looking around trying to understand what who their allies are, right? So values-based supply chains. Hadn't really thought about that, I think, since the Cold War, pre-Cold War, right? And you don't really know yet still who has which values, right? You're still looking around even within the European Union, trying to understand where's France going and what's its relationship to China and how does it really view Russia. So I think it's really hard to predict, and I think it's very fragile at this point.
Questions have come from that side of the room, perhaps because I've been blind to hands up on this side of the room. But I would want to
back here.
try.
Didn't you have a question?
Oh, it's been answered.
Hold on for just a minute. We literally haven't had, yes, sir. I'll get it to you.
Thank you, Steve. It's a wonderful presentation. My name is Tom Kono. I'm working with the United Nations, and I'm spouse of a former fellow, Catherine Ross. Since I have been working with the UN, I have a lot of issues with Greece and Turkey, but South Macedonia. You talked about regionalism, Hellenism, Hellenistic culture. Then the Cold War ended, and former Yugoslavia broke up. And then one of the areas which borders with Greece decided to call itself Macedonia. Greece said no. So over almost about 2 decades, there has a big issues between the two countries. So Macedonia was not allowed to be called Macedonia. So they go to former Yugoslavia or Macedonia, the Fyrom. And recently, finally, they agreed on the term South Macedonia, and Greece is okay. So I was wondering, what this regionalism, what the identity, and while the relationship between Greece and South Macedonia, and I can't get the bottom of this. So if you can explain that, I would appreciate it. Thank you. Oh, North Macedonia. Yes, North Macedonia.
Well, if I had more time in my fellowship, that's the place that I would want to go next. Is the border between Greece and North Macedonia and Albania. I think that the northwestern corner of Greece, I think, is another really interesting region to experience. Both, I think, the Greek minorities in Albania and also the history of migration, because I think, one thing that I learned from living in Thrace is just how recent the current borders between these countries are. It's really the end of the 19th century when the whole region of, the greater historical region of Thrace was split up into southern Bulgaria, northern Greece, and western Turkey. And so there used to be kind of nomadic tribes that would take their flocks all over the region of Thrace, and not, disregarding the current boundaries that we have now, but sort of using the rivers, the Evros River, the Nestos River, and then the mountain ranges of the Rhodope as the sort of geographical or geological boundaries of this much larger region. So I think there definitely are, so many cultural similarities. I remember, I took trips as part of the fellowship into Bulgaria and into Turkey, and it's practically, lots of similarities between the same food that are called different names in different countries, or different types of embroidery, different types of traditional dance. I think this larger region of the Balkans is much more similar than it is different. But I think the national impulse to create these different countries from the 20th and 21st century sort of pulls us towards examining the differences as opposed to the similarities, I would say.
This is a question to you, Steve. First of all, my name is Joseph Batat. I'm a member of the board of the ICWA. You are very close to the end of your fellowship, and you have accumulated tremendous amount of understanding and knowledge about Greece for the last 7, 8 years. What are you going to do with all that?
Thank you, Joe. This is a very good question. I think my goal from the beginning has been, I've lived in Greece for 7 years, and I've had opportunities through different positions, through ICWA, through my Fulbright, and through my work at the embassy, to just learn as much as possible about Greece and to talk to as many people as possible. And I really want to now take all of that understanding, the friendships that I've gathered, the experiences, and put them into one or more books. So I'm a fiction writer by trade, and I really have this impulse to go back to fiction writing. When I first came to Greece on my Fulbright, my intention was to use Greek mythology as a way to rewrite the myths and to talk about contemporary Greece. But I quickly found that, just arriving in the country, I didn't know enough about Greece to write what I thought would be compelling, sort of deep characters. And so now I feel like I'm ready to begin to create some fictional sketches and to also set stories in these places where I've had the great fortune to live as an ICWA fellow. So I think you'll be seeing fiction from me set in Evros and Chios and Crete. And I think a lot of these friendships and contacts that I've developed will sort of be not just the seed for fictional characters, but regions and people that I'll continue to visit and have sort of just a really long-term and deep-seated interest and connection to. So I think, even though I have plans to move to Switzerland, once my fellowship is done, it's close enough to Greece where I think I'll be coming back pretty frequently. And I think a part of me will always be Greek moving forward.
So let me ask a question. Earlier, someone raised the question about foreigners never quite feeling fully at home in Greece. And I was puzzled over that. So one way of explaining it would be this. To be Greek is to be an Orthodox Christian of a special sort. It's no longer the case to be an Englishman is to be an Anglican, to be a Frenchman is to be a Catholic, even to be a Spaniard is to be a Catholic. But religion is more fully bound up with the definition of being Greek. And you can see it in the United States, in which the churches in the United States, the Greek Orthodox churches, form a kind of almost political party. It's not quite right to say that, but am I wrong about this? And all three of you have sort of puzzled over this, I'm sure.
So I think that's a really good point, Paul. I think what you see in the U.S. is that the Greek Orthodox Church is sort of the communal center of the Greek community. It's where you take your Greek language lessons as a kid. Celebrations occur around the church. In Greece, you celebrate your name day as opposed to your birthday. Easter is the celebration of the year, and so I think that throughout the history of Greece, there have been sort of these two definitions of what it means to be Greek. You have the very strict definition of being born in a specific place, and then you have a more fluid definition, which is anyone who is able to speak Greek can be Greek. And I think that's sort of the definition that I subscribe to, maybe for self-serving reasons. But I think even though I always stick out in a crowd of Greek people, I think that living in Greece and slowly learning about the culture, this, different songs that, Greek pop songs or TV show references, and then embracing the language. I feel that, I have developed really strong friendships in Greece and feel in many ways that, Greek people have embraced me into their culture. And so I think that's the definition I would go with.
Tough one. I do think that religion plays a big role. I think it's for many people, it's the culture around the festivities around Easter rather than the religious part of it. But they're still related to church, but it doesn't necessarily mean that someone is religious by following some of these procedural kind of things or celebrating their name day. I do think that being part of Greek culture, and that includes some Greek language, not necessarily being fluent, is still kind of the test of whether you can integrate into the Greek society as it is right now. That being said, the tradition of Philhellenism, of people who are friends of Greece, is so strong, and it's another part, almost a part of our identity as a nation. Philhellenism is. So it's inclusive of foreigners who will indulge us and study us or come and join, be it for vacation or be it to stay for longer periods of time or work from there. So deep down, I think that there is the interest to include more people, and the diaspora, of course. I mean, as we're going to newer generations of diaspora, many of the people of Greek descent do not speak the language anymore. Does it make them less Greek? Well, it's up to us to define.
I think basically I'm going to go with Katerina's earlier point about the language. It's not a multicultural society, and it's interesting to think about why that is. I mean, I think the church around the world has played a role of transmitting the culture, right? There are battles in the United States that many people who remember about, the liturgy and should it be in English, and that took a long time to work out. So in an unstable part of the world, in a country, Greece, that was occupied for hundreds of years, it was the bearer of Greek culture. I don't think of, when we talk about religion, it has many different facets, right? I don't think of the Greek people as pious, right? Right? So they're not. So it's not that, right? It played a different role. And in some ways, because I think Greece has had a global footprint and it has a global diaspora, in some ways that makes Greece itself more conservative, right? Because it is diversifying. It is Greece is very multicultural if you took all of Greeks together around the world. But the home base, the physical home base, Greece, the church, which is the conservator of that culture, I think kind of doubles down in that role, and that's hard to break except if you know the language.
I hope you can join me in congratulating Stephen and thanking Katerina.
Thank you so much, Katerina, Gregory, Stephen, Paul. That was fascinating. And you can read all of Stephen's dispatches on our website, icwa.org. Also, thank you very much to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation again for supporting the fellowship, and to you all for coming and taking part. Thank you and good night.